Good evening. Welcome to our Midweek Bible Study. I'm so excited to have this evening. We're grateful, Lord, for all of this and the ability to get together. And we thank you for coming as well. We do want to encourage you, or I want to encourage you to come and be a part of this live if you can at any moment or at any time that you can, because we do a lot to be able to break some of this down and to be able to talk through it. It helps us come up with a better application of it as we move forward. But irregardless, we're glad to get started this evening. We are continuing our journey through the book of Isaiah. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, prior to the Christmas or the Thanksgiving break, we covered the second chapter. Today, we'll cover the third chapter, and we kind of get into the judgment a little bit. And as we begin here this evening, there are a few things that we need to mention that kind of help to set the stage, if you will, for what we're going to talk about today. The first thing is God created man. Man did not create God. He is who he is. We are who we are. And there's a significant delta or distance in between God and man, or creator and created, if you will. The second thing is people at this time, or in this time, as well as in our time today, put way too much focus on what man can do. And the people were focused here on what God could do for them, or they should be focused on what God could do for them. And they were infatuated with the idea that man could help them escape their problems or simply escape reality. And essentially, it's kind of like having some comfort around people that you trust and know, but realizing that none of those people can actually save you. It's God that can actually save you. The third thing is, and this is leading to a time where man would be humbled and would absolutely recognize where their strength really comes from. And so unfortunately, it gets to a point of destruction, but nonetheless, they recognize the fact that God is God and we are not. So we get started. The first verse in here says, "For behold, the Lord of hosts, takes away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stock and the store, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water." Now, God, who provided everything for his people, can also take what he has provided away. And in this case, Judah was being disobedient and focusing its attention on idols and other gods. And this would ultimately lead to a reset, if you will, kind of putting things back in place. And so that's what is the beginning of this. And you can see where they had provisions, but God would soon take those away. Verses 2-5 says, "The mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet, and the diviner and the elder, the chaplain of 50, or the captain of 50, and the honorable man, the counselor and the skillful artisan, and the expert enchanter. I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child will be insolent toward the elder, and the base toward the honorable." And as I said at the beginning, people had begun to place their faith in everything on other men. So verse 2 points to the strength of those who are battle hardened. And the real question is, do you find your strength and comfort in those who can and will fight for you or your freedom? Or do you find that it comes from somewhere eternal, like God, for example? In the latter part of verses 2 and 3, we see several types of people mentioned. And the unfortunate part about it is we tend to place our faith many times in people who are famous or people who can do something that most others can't, like athletes or things like that. And we put way too much into them. And we forget about God in the midst of that. They become idols to us. And you can see where instead of leading everything, like you see many actors or actresses making their public statements on politics and other stuff, and how they can kind of control narratives and things like that because they have this power that comes through themselves being famous. They would all be humbled, and it's God who would ultimately humble them. So all these things that these people were facing and are putting their faith into, as far as man was concerned, all that was going to be taken away. In the latter part of verse 2 and 3, we see these people types here. Today, we even find famous people, again, that are very important to us. And the question really has to be, are they in charge of you? And it depends on where our attention is. If you look at verses 4 and 5, God's people would be given over to other earthly forces because of their disobedience. And the issue that I see with this is generational issues that surround the punishment. In other words, it's not only going to affect the people, it's going to affect generations to come. You know, I hear people say all the time that I want to do what I can to make sure my grandkids have a world they can live in, or a country they can live in, or things like that. You don't understand, it's affecting multiple generations because of the disobedience of one. And so it literally is a generational issue, and it, unfortunately, the punishment will affect that as well. Beginning in verse 6, it says, when a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have clothing, you be our ruler, and let these ruins be under your power. In that day he will protest, saying, I cannot cure your ills, for in my house is neither food nor clothing. Do not make me a ruler of the people, for Jerusalem stumbled and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. Now, the control of the country, the people will ultimately be given over to children in this case. And think about this for a moment. How many children are capable of leading with the limited amount of experience that they have? And the experience that they do have would not fix what the people had done toward the Lord. So they were going to be led by people that were not qualified. It was obviously not going to be good for them. It was going to be disaster. And yet there was nothing that those young people or babies or whatever would be able to take and help fix for guiding the people back to God. It was going to take an ultimate reset for them. Verse 9 says, the look on their countenance to witness against them, and they declared their sin as Sodom. They did not hide it, or they do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. Say to the righteous that it shall be with or well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for the reward of his hand shall be given him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths. Now, this part of the text shows the great immense amount of pain that the people would feel. And it also indicates that they deserve what they get because of what they did. Now, as for the women and children ruling over them, you have to look at this in context and at the time of which it was written. And it's a far different time in history and in culture than what we encounter today. Women tended to be property as opposed to co-equals, if you will, in the relationships that we have today. So it's just a vastly different world. So you have to understand how much was happening and why it was happening. And also how important it was to say that now women and children were going to rule over them, because that was vastly different in their culture. That would have been an incredible hardship, if you will. Verse 13 says, the Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes. For you have eaten up the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding their faces of the poor? Grinding the faces of the poor, says the Lord of hosts. Now, one way to look at this section might be like this. The people have become fat and happy in where they were in life. They have become involved and actively participating in the culture of the surrounding people. The problem is that none of that was honoring God, but actually pulling them away. And it would end up with them being crushed or coming back to God. It would affect the entire nation, though. I think the word crushing is one of those things where you can feel the immense amount of pressure and power that's against you when that happens. Verse 16 says, moreover, the Lord says, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a jingling with their feet. Therefore, the Lord will strike with the scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will uncover their secret parts. And that day the Lord will take away the finery and the jingling anklets and the scarves and the crescents and the pendants and the bracelets and the veils, the headdresses, the leg ornaments and the headbands, the perfume boxes, the charms and the rings, the nose jewels, the festival apparel and the mantles, the outer garments, the purses and the mirrors, the fine linen, the turbans and the robes. Now this looks like a different section to us, but the fact of the matter is, you can see here where the people have gotten fixated on themselves and their adornment, their decoration, their all of those things. And so all these things are worldly things. The interesting thing to me is that when you look at it, it says, therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the crown on the head of the daughters of Zion. In other words, that crown will be taken off and it will literally be like a scab. And I don't know, that's just a gross picture, but nonetheless, it's a real picture of what it looks like to be able to take off the haughty and be able to have it just scab up because of what's happening. But it would take away all of these things that they counted as adornments. In other words, they decorated themselves and it was a pride thing. And so they were literally taking off all of this stuff that would all disappear, so none of it would mean anything. As we get going into this next section, it looks like it's something that's separate from the judgment. However, it does something just a little bit different. For them, it would remind them of how special they really are and were. The problem, though, is that they have lost their part as their beauty is now tainted because of their sin. And they built themselves up by what they had, and their hearts were rotten. So you have to kind of get that picture. And how rotten were they? Well, look at verse 24. It says, and so it shall be. Instead of a sweet smell, there will be a stench. Instead of a sash, a rope. Instead of well-set hair, baldness. Instead of rich robe, a girding of sackcloth. And then remember, sackcloth was grinding on you, so it was not comfortable. And branding instead of beauty. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty in the war, and their gates shall lament and mourn, and she being desolate shall sit on the ground. I don't know about you, but that is all bad. None of that sounds good. None of it sounds comfortable. All of it sounds uncomfortable. And why? Because they're all rotten. So here's what you get. Stench is the result of that. The interesting thing is that when something smells, who is punished for it? Well, I would argue that everyone is punished for it. And this means that it affects the entire nation as well as those that depend upon the nation for survival. There would be utter destruction that would happen because of it, and everybody would be affected. The strength of man will not save you. It will not save us. The once grand city that would be toppled, and those who had the pride of being God's chosen people would now be put to shame because of their sin. The final part talks about being desolate. And I don't think we get a real good picture of that, but in honesty, this means that the once great city would now be deserted of people and in an utter state of bleak and dismal emptiness. Now, we can all probably recollect or recall a time when we went through a ghost town, for example. If you got to go to one of those Old West ghost towns or whatever, you get a sense of what it might have looked like at one time, but you see the broken down, you see the empty, you see the desolate part of that, and you see that emptiness absolutely. And so that's kind of the picture of what Israel would look like. Now, I want to take you back just briefly before we close and let you know that if you go to Jerusalem today, it is a grand city. It is beautiful. It is awesome. It is big. You can see it from a distance, and it is a city of God. The unfortunate part about it is that now, since everything has grown up around it, it's hard to recollect how grand it was at one time. And the interesting thing to me is if you were to look at it through the eyes of the Israelites who lived there at this time, that would have been something of awe as they came up to it, because there wasn't anything else around it. So here's the city with city walls, fortified, everything is there. And it would have been a place of great color and of great sound and of all these great things. And so if you can imagine now, what they would see is desolate. And it's not a good picture, But unfortunately, it paints a good picture of what is going to happen to us, or at least to those who don't reconcile themselves to God. The people here were not reconciling themselves to God. In fact, they had running away from him as they were running towards men and counting on humanity and not counting on God. So I hope that this was a good lesson for you. It certainly was a good lesson for me and enjoyed preparing it. Look forward to seeing you live at some point in time. Until that time, please enjoy. If you have any questions, feel free to put a note on the video or send me an email. My email address is Allen, ALLEN, at bbcburleson.org. You can certainly do that, and I'll answer any questions that I can. I pray that God will bless you. I pray you have a good rest of the week, and we will talk to you soon.